Okay, so we're going to go into our last topic for AP1, and that is nervous system. And for April 6th lab, we're going to be doing brain, introduction to the nervous system, brain and cranial nerves. Okay, so these are covered by your chapters 16 and 17. And so as you will see, in chapter 16, you're going to come across many things that you have already come across, like your synapse and neuron structure and so on, which we have been introduced to earlier during the course. However, the chapter 17 brain, the terminology is extensive, so you will have to learn those things. Okay. All right, so let's start with chapter 16, which is basically your introduction to nervous system. Okay, so when we look at it, you want to remember part of what you learned in your muscle physiology, right? Chapter 11, the neuromuscular junction. Like I said, we'll touch upon those things once again. Okay. Now, the nervous system main thing is it's the communication. That's a main role of the nervous system in our body, and big communication between different parts of the body, different organs, and so on and so forth. And also, it helps in the coordination, like walking, um, and digestion and all that, orientation to the environment, so you can perceive whether it is hot or cold, those kinds of sensory functions, and then assimilation of information. That means processing, right? So what you see, what are you seeing, right? So whatever your eyes perceive, your brain processes and say, oh, okay, what I'm looking at is my friend, right? That sort of thing. And you have to understand, even though many animals have a nervous system, the humans have a very complex nervous system, right? So mainly, they can stand on two legs. One difference from other animals. Second difference is that human brain is much more, well, in many cases it's bigger, but also it is much more complex, right? There are functional regions, and the networking is very different, and so on and so forth. So it becomes very important for us to understand what comprises the nervous system and how nervous system functions. All right. First, we want to learn the divisions in the nervous system. Okay, so broad divisions. First division, level of division, you have your central nervous system versus your peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system comprises of your brain and the spinal cord, right? So brain and spinal cord, they both come under central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system, on the other hand, is composed of nerves that come out of the spinal cord. So the spinal nerves, then your dorsal root ganglia, and then somatic nerves, which go into the extremities and so on, and also your cranial nerves, right? So dorsal root ganglia, we'll talk about it later, but mainly ganglia usually is like a cluster of neurons, right? And so dorsal root ganglia are they make connections with your spinal nerves and so on, and so they are very, very important information centers. Okay. Now, so that was central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system itself is going to be also divided into two. Those are your sensory division and your motor division. Sensory division are the nerves that are going to collect information from everywhere and then send it to the brain. Right? Motor division is composed of neurons or nerves that are going to take the message from the brain and then deliver it to the different parts of the body. Right? And so, for example, let's say you are you're by mistake you hold your hand very close to your stove, right? So it's hot and it's on, and so it's hot, and so when you bring your hand close to your stove, then your sensory neurons understand or sense, oh, that is high temperature, right? And that immediately that sensory input is relayed back to the brain. Then the brain says, oh, you're going to get burnt, and that is not a good temperature for your body. So the motor neurons now come and say, take it away, right? And so you can kind of see the coordination there. Yeah. So now sensory division and motor division, like I said, are parts of your peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now the motor division also is divided into two: somatic motor nervous system and also autonomic motor nervous system. Somatic nervous system is generally like, for the muscles and so on and so forth. The autonomic nervous system, it has the brain centers like your medulla, pons, midbrain, and so on. So those kinds of areas. In addition, autonomic nervous system is very important for controlling many of the involuntary things, like when it is very hot, or you're going to be exerting yourself, then your heart rate keeps up, right? Oh, you're walking very fast, so I'll pump more blood. And those kinds of decisions are all made by your autonomic nervous system. You don't have to tell anything. Your nervous system takes care of those things. Okay. So please, first thing you want to understand the divisions of the nervous system. Next is going to be your neurons. Okay. So it is already given in your picture. 16.2, right? So this is very important, and we have gone through this the parts of the neuron many times. So please re-familiarize yourself with that if you have forgotten. Basically, how you have the dendrites, you have the cell body with the nucleus and cytoplasm, mitochondria, and the cytoplasm in the neurons generally is called missile bodies. And then you have the axon hillock, and then the axon, the projection that comes out of the cell body. Eventually it ends in the synaptic terminal, where it makes connections called synapse with the target cell, right? And there are two types of neurons, sensory neurons. They're called afferent neurons. So they basically bring information to the central nervous system. And then, so you can say A for arriving in the central nervous system. Efferent neurons, on the other hand, exit the nerve system and go and give the message to somewhere else. Okay. Many times you will see that neurons are not like, it's not one axon going through like, meters of miles and miles of distance. A lot of times there will be association neurons, also called interneurons. They kind of make connections between two neurons. It basically relaying, right? So like that, intermediate steps. Neurons come in many shapes. I don't know if we talked about it earlier, but basically you can have multipolar neurons. That means you will have many dendrites in the dendrite area, and then one axon exits the cell body. Many neurons in our body are in the central nervous system are multipolar, and even the picture that I showed you, this one is multipolar. So you can have many dendritic branches. Then you have your bipolar neurons. This has nothing to do with bipolar disease, so don't mistake it like that. But bipolar basically means two poles, right? So you have one dendritic branch and then one axon. That's it, right? Usually you find bipolar neurons in olfactory neurons, and also like vision. And then you have pseudo unipolar neurons. Those are basically you don't have too much of dendrite, but it's like an axon or something like that comes out, right? And then you get it goes to the cell body, and then you have the axon divided branches, right? And so like that. So you see that in here in on page 236. Gives you a very good idea of how multipolar, bipolar, and pseudo unipolar neurons look like. Okay. Then again, we have come across the synapses. So please learn that, presynaptic terminal, the synaptic cleft, postsynaptic membrane, and so on. Synaptic vesicles, how they, by exocytosing, they disperse the neurotransmitter, which then carries on with the message to the target cell. Other than neurons, we also have other types of cells in the body. Glial cells, you have Schwann cells, or they're also called neurolemocytes. And then sometimes you have your oligodendrocytes. Both of them are responsible for myelin production, and they can wrap around an axon in order to myelinate the axon. And the regions that are not myelinated are called nodes of Ranvier. And then a lot of times when fast conduction is necessary, then the electrical conduction happens between the nodes of Ranvier, one node to the other, right? That kind of conductance is called saltatory movement of communication. So it's faster, okay? Myelin gives the neuron whitish color, right? And that's why in white matter of the brain, you'll see a whole lot of myelinated neurons, whereas in the gray matter, you do not. They are unmyelinated fibers, okay, in the gray matter. So yeah, so oligodendrocytes in the or the cells in the central nervous system that produce your myelin. Schwann cells are in the peripheral nervous system. They also produce myelin. Other than Schwann cells, basically part of glial cell, you have oligodendrocytes, and then you can also have astrocytes, which look like little stars. They're important for blood-brain barrier formation. And then you have microglia. Microglia are phagocytic, so they're like the immune cells in the nervous system. Then you can also have ependymal cells. Okay, so these cells are all the pictures are all given here on page 238, right? So you can see like the oligodendrocytes, microglia, and that's your astrocyte. This is the star-shaped cells, and then that's your ependymal cells. Okay? So that, let me see if I have anything to add to this. Yeah, I will show you the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. No, I don't want to show parasympathetic nervous system right now. Let me see. What was I thinking? Peripheral nerves. No, that's okay. So that concludes your chapter 16. So I will now move on to chapter 17. There you're going to be introduced to brain and cranial nerves. Okay, so you all know where the brain is, inside here, right? And okay, so mainly first, when you're learning about brain, you have to learn the regional categorization of the brain, but also, and then brain has its own way of looking, right? Like regions, right? Separate regions, but then you look at them in different ways of categorization. So we're going to look at ventricles, that is other regions, and then you are also going to look at like hemispheres. That's another way of regionalizing the brain. Anyway, so let's first start with the membranes. Okay, so the brain is covered by three membranes. These are called meninges, right? So okay, so the meninges, there are three. The outermost is called dura mater, right? It's not matter, M-A-T-T-E-R. It's actually M-A-T-E-R. In Latin, it means mother, right? And so dura mater is basically strong mother. So it's like outermost, and it's very, very enduring sort of membrane area of the brain. And then the next deeper to that is your arachnoid matter, right? So the space between your dura mater and the arachnoid matter, it's called subdural space. And then arachnoid matter is called arachnoid because it's kind of like a spider web sort of appearance. So arachnoid refers to spiders, and so that's why it got its name. And then the third layer, third membrane, is called your pia mater, right? And that was a little one, right? And so the space between your arachnoid matter and your pia mater is called subarachnoid space. Okay. Now the generally like overview of the brain, it comes from the adult brain actually comes from three regions during embryonic development, right? Those are called prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. These are in embryo. You see these distinct areas in the brain. Okay, so the prosencephalon of the embryonic brain later becomes forebrain, right? And so it gets your cerebrum and diencephalon, and then the mesencephalon area of the embryonic brain becomes your midbrain, and which is kind of small in the adult. And then the third embryonic section is called rhombencephalon. That becomes your hindbrain, which comprises of pons, medulla oblongata, and cerebellum. Right? And so those are the three different areas, and these are depicted in your book. That's your dura mater, pia mater, and arachnoid matter. Those are depicted here. And the three prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon are depicted in this. Okay. Now, then you have your ventricles, right? So the ventricles are put in this picture, right? That is figure 17.3. And we have 4 ventricles in the brain. And again, these are specialized areas in the brain. And this comes from the neural tube in the embryonic during embryonic development. And so you have your and then these ventricles are very important because they are going to be fed by this set of capillaries called choroid plexus. These choroid plexus, like I said, are the capillaries, little tubes, and they produce cerebrospinal fluid. And that fluid is going to be going through the ventricles, thereby nourishing them. So the cerebrospinal fluid has ions and salts and some proteins and everything. And so you need to get that going. So there is a specific circulatory system in the brain that's going there using a cerebrospinal fluid. And also the cerebrospinal fluid from the choroid plexus, when it goes into the ventricles and everything, it takes not only a particular direction, but also only so much of this fluid has to go there, right? So if the circulation of the CSF is blocked in some way, then you can actually create accumulation of the spinal fluid, and that is very, very dangerous. Okay, especially like in children, you can get like what is called it can basically put pressure on the because it's swelling with a lot of fluid, right? So that can cause pressure on the ventricles, and therefore brain damage can occur. And you can develop a condition called internal hydrocephalus. Okay, so all of these things you need to know. Okay, and then when you look at the surface view of the brain, you want to see the forebrain and the hindbrain like that, right? So it's a little bit comparable to the skull because of the frontal area and the temporal area and everything. But then the brain has its own terminology. So you want to take a moment or many moments in learning about the regions of the brain, right? This color-coded picture is particularly useful because it's not only, so this is this pop that's sticking out, that's your frontal. and that's your backside. So this is your frontal ear, forebrain, and this is your hindbrain. So this part is your midbrain, like that, right? And so those things you have to understand. And then your cerebellum, medulla oblongata, you might have heard of all those things. Cerebrum is in the frontal forebrain. Then you will also see these very unique things about the brain, right? You see these ridges and depressions, right? So those ridges are called gyri or gyrus for singular, and then the depressions or the fissures, they're called sulci, right? Singular is sulcus. And these are very important, and also they also act as structural markers, so you can, so which gyrus or which sulcus you're looking at. So you have the brain lobes. They are like a frontal lobe, right? Temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe, corresponding to your bones, skull bones. And then you have a lateral fissure that separates the temporal bone from your frontal and parietal lobes, like that, right? So all of those things are you need to know. So in your book, these are sort of classified or put in separate topics as frontal lobe, what are the parts that are there, parietal lobe, what are the parts like that, right? So it's very useful, actually. It's very simplified version that's given in your book, in the manual. That is the minimal amount of knowledge you have to acquire from there. We'll learn more about the physiology of the neurons and the communications going on between the parts of the brain and so on, how specifically they control different functions in the body, and all we'll learn in the physiology. But then here you want to learn what are the important parts that are there. I don't want to list everything, because I'm not going to be adding too much information to it than what is in your book. So, for example, in your frontal lobe, you have your central sulcus, that's fine, but you also have your Broca area, or the motor speech area, right? And that Broca area basically controls the muscles that enable you to speak, right? This is different from your Wernicke area, which is also language related, a part of your brain, but that is in your parietal lobe, not in the frontal lobe, like that. Okay? And then you have your primary cortex, motor cortex in the frontal lobe, and so on. The other thing you want to learn also is the homunculus. A lot of times, the centers that are in a particular lobe or area of the brain, what are they controlling, right? That will be represented by this. So it will be like a little representation of the human being. So homunculus is basically a little version of a human being, right? And so in here, it will tell you what are the areas that are controlled by that particular what are the different parts of the body and the functions that are controlled by a particular region of the brain, like that, right? So that's your primary motor cortex. And so you will see that it controls in the hip and knee area, in the eyes and everything, what eyes, like, mouth and all those things. So like I said, you want to look at the different lobes. What are the parts that are in that area, in that lobe, and what is the functional significance of these parts? Only what is given on your manual, nothing extra. Okay. Occipital lobe, of course, is your visual part of the brain, so it has your optic chiasma. Temporal lobe, on the other hand, has both your auditory control and your smell, olfactory, and also your taste, right? So that's in your temporal lobe. Then you may have heard of cerebral hemispheres. So the brain also has hemispheres, right? So where you can make two halves, and that is what is depicted in this picture, right? And as you see, the two hemispheres of the brain are separated by that longitudinal, very, very distinct longitudinal fissure. Okay. And so sometimes you may have heard of people saying, oh, she's very creative. Her left hemisphere must be sorry, right hemisphere must be over developed or something. So there is some truth in that actually. Your left hemisphere generally controls language and reasoning. So apparently people who have left hemisphere more developed or something, they'll be more logical and everything. And then imaginative, creative people, like musicians and so on, they'll have a right hemisphere more developed. In general, most of us have equal sizes in here. The activity may be different in one hemisphere versus the other. Okay. Sometimes there is structural asymmetry between the two hemispheres that will account for what is called hemispheric dominance. Okay. One hemisphere dominates over the other. Then if you look at the inferior sections of the brain, then you will see forebrain. Then you can see your pituitary gland, mammillary bodies, optic chiasma, and so on. Like so, if you look at this kind of, actually you can see it in here. Okay, you see the frontal lobe there. Then optic chiasma is here, that X sort of thing, right? That's your optic chiasma. So the optic nerves actually cross over each other. And so, but you can see it also here, right? So this is, you have sectioned the thing, and then between the hemispheres, then the C-shaped structure is called corpus callosum, this part, right? So that is in between the two hemispheres. That's your pituitary gland, and then you have your mammillary bodies, and so on and so forth, right? So, and then you can see the choroid plexus there. The choroid plexus are from here, right? And that is basically where the cerebrospinal fluid comes. So you want to learn all of those things in the inferior section, mid-sagittal section, your diencephalon, and then the thalamus, that's in your midbrain, right? So that is here. Let me see. This part, right? So that is your midbrain. And so you see the thalamus, and then beneath that is your hypothalamus, right? And so you can see how the hypothalamus and pituitary are connected, right? So they are the master controls of the endocrine system. And then yeah, midbrain, there are many centers there as well, cerebri pectum, and then you have your processes known as corpora quadrigemina, gemina, and then you have your superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. Superior colliculi for visual and auditory reflexes, right, immediately reflex and everything, and then inferior colliculi involved in auditory pathways also. Then the midbrain also contains substantia nigra, right? And substantia nigra neurons are so important because those are the neurons, or substantia nigra is the part of the brain that gets that starts to degenerate in Parkinson's patients, and that's also in the midbrain. And then hindbrain. So like I said, you have your pons, there is your respiratory center, and all those regulatory centers are there, medulla oblongata, and then you have your cerebellum. It's like the fan-shaped structure. And then that is the one, it goes from the medulla oblongata only, you're going to get your spinal cord. So if you cut the brain coronally, right, and then you're going to see your unmyelinated gray matter, unmyelinated white matter, and that is actually shown here. Okay? So you're cutting the brain like this, and then you can see all those things. Then you also want to know about limbic system. Limbic system is the region of the brain that controls emotions, sexual desire, fear, all kinds of things, right? And so when limbic system something goes wrong in limbic system, you are unable to control your emotions. Some people start crying, right? And they don't even know why they're crying, like that. Those kinds of things can happen. So that is your limbic system, and we'll learn more. Limbic system is actually depicted here. We'll learn more of those things in the lectures. Then you have your brain stem. That's like part of your hindbrain. Then we move on to cranial nerves, right? So cranial nerves, again, I'm not going to list them. All you need to know is there is 12 pairs of cranial nerves. These are coming out of the brain, right? They have nothing to do with spinal cord, because we are going to learn spinal nerves that are different. So the cranial nerves come from the brain, and then they go and influence different parts of the body, right? So there is two ways of depicting them. One is they each of the pairs have very specific names, right? But generally we go by Roman numerals, cranial nerve 1 through cranial nerve 12, right? So usually it is CN and then Roman numeral 1, or CN Roman numeral 2, like that. Okay, so anterior to posterior, usually we cranial nerve 1, 2, 3, like that, except for 12 and 11 are mixed up. But then up to 10, okay, up to 10, you have, they are labeled from anterior to posterior, like that, right? And like I said, they have specific names, and you also need to, we will learn, especially in lecture section, what is the significance of each of the cranial nerves, what is the area that they innervate, and so on, right? But then you need to know the not only a cranial nerve 1, 2, or something like that. You need to know the specific names, right? So it starts with your olfactory nerve, right? So you have cranial nerve 1, olfactory nerve. Then you have an optic nerve, oculomotor nerve, right? Then you have a trochlear nerve, a trigeminal, like that, right? And your manual actually puts a mnemonic for that. Old Oliver Og traveled to Africa for very good vacations and holidays. So you want to remember OOO, right? So olfactory, optic, oculomotor, then everything is pretty unique. Okay. So that concludes, you do not have to do the sheep dissection, but I'm just going to show some dissection, virtual dissection of the brain. So, and also of the cranial nerves, okay? All right, let's go. Brain coronal section, right? That's the brain, left hemisphere, parietal lobe, cerebrum, fissure, olfactory bulb, lateral sulcus, frontal lobe, temporal lobe. So you're looking at the front, from the front of the brain, right? So that's why this is the left hemisphere. So you can see that. So it's actually showing here what kind of view you are looking. So let's dissect that. So now you can see that's the gray matter, right? The gray matter is kind of not white. Internal capsule, that's fine. Septum pellucidum, right? That's a dividing thing. Caudate nucleus, white matter. These are the myelinated neurons. These are unmyelinated. Putamen, optic chiasm. So you start to see the part of that X, optic chiasma. Okay, corpus callosum, you start to see the corpus callosum. Okay, And fornix of the brain, lateral ventricle, thalamus, again midbrain, third ventricle, hypothalamus, right? Mammillary body, this little protrusion there, globus pallidus, okay, hippocampus. That's the hippocampus. That's the learning center and learning and memory. Okay. Cerebral aqueduct. This is the principal passageway for the cerebrospinal fluid. Superior colliculus, like I said, right? Those are for the processing of optic and auditory pathways. Red nucleus, cerebral peduncle, substantia nigra. This is the portion that's very important for motor function and stuff, and which is sort of degenerates in Parkinson's. Cerebral crus, fourth ventricle, cerebellum. So you start to see the cerebellum, that's a part of the hindbrain. Pontine fibers, right? Part of the pons, corticospinal tract. Okay. What do we have here? Inferior olivary complex. They look like olives, that's what they call like that. Pyramidal tract, cerebellar peduncle. Okay. Coronal inferior. So we are looking from low, right? From bottom. We are looking at that. And this is a very good view. You can see many things here. So there's your optic chiasma, right? Like that acts. But you can see the optic nerve. So you can see the brain there, okay? So olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, frontal lobe, okay? That's your cranial nerve 2, optic nerve, oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3, trochlear nerve 4, trigeminal nerve 5. So you can see these nerves like, next to each other. Vagus nerve 10, accessory nerve, that's your hypoglossal, that's your 12. And then the accessory nerve, which is the 11th. That I told you, like all of them are in order except for these two. That's your spinal cord, right? Spinal cord already there. Medulla oblongata, glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve. So you have a pair, right? One this side, one that side. That's your cerebellum, right? Temporal lobe. Okay. Lateral. Okay. So we are the mandibular. Okay. Dermatome. That's fine. So let's just be removing the skull here. And that's your dura mater, the outermost covering of the brain. Meninges, first meninges. Right? So that's your parietal lobe, occipital lobe, frontal lobe. That's your gyrus. You can see that, right? Precentral gyrus, that's the ridge, right? Postcentral gyrus, central. That's your central sulcus. That sulcus. This is pre-gyrus and the post-gyrus, lateral sulcus. So these are hallmarks. So these divide one lobe from the other like that. Then you have your temporal lobe, cranial nerve 11, right? Accessory nerve. There you have your dorsal root ganglia. We'll learn about it later. Spinal root. Okay. Ah. So that's your corpus callosum, right? That's like that. That's okay. So parietal, okay, fornix, and then pellucidum. That's it. Thalamus, and then your third ventricle, midbrain, pineal gland, right there. Fourth ventricle, cerebellum, right? Cerebellum at the hindbrain, brainstem, pons, medulla oblongata, and then your spinal cord. Mammillary body is there, very little. Then you can see a pituitary gland here hanging from the, that's your hypothalamus. So you have your thalamus, hypothalamus, and then your pituitary gland. That's your optic chiasma. Okay, so now let's see if we can identify some of the other things here. So that's your, okay, nerve, mandibular. These are other nerves. We don't really need to know them now. Okay, you're shaven the head, you're moving the removing some of, now you already see the dura mater there, arachnoid granulations. So these are your hemispheres. You can see this is your longitudinal fissure. You can see that central sulcus, frontal lobe here, left cerebral hemisphere, parietal lobe. Okay, white matter, gray matter, gyrus sulcus, corpus callosum, right? So the corpus callosum comes as a C, right? So one is called splenium or something like that, and then the other one is called genu. So there are two different parts of the corpus callosum. Anterior horn, fornix, okay. Thalamus, splenium of the corpus callosum, and then the other is the, so it's basically going to go like that, right? So that is your genu. Temporal lobe, occipital lobe. So you can see some of the nerves. These are all cut, right? So the glossopharyngeal nerve there, facial nerve, trochlear nerve, oculomotor nerve. So all of the nerves, you can see that they've been dissected, right? So you can see the nerves are arranged in the beautiful order. Okay? So I want to just show the cranial nerves. So you can see that's olfactory bulb, basically associated with olfactory nerve, optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, oculomotor 3, trochlear 4, trigeminal 5, abducens 6, um, facial 7, vestibulocochlear 8, there, glossopharyngeal 9, vagus 10, right? The hypoglossal 12, and then accessory 11. So if you want, I can show dissection for a couple of these cranial nerves. The right hemisphere olfactory nerve, right? So you can already start to see that. Diencephalon, that's a part of the midbrain. Then you have your pons, cerebrum, medulla oblongata. And if you want to go to optic nerve, hemisphere, okay. So basically now you can see that is connected to the eye, right? So optic nerve, diencephalon, so that those are your markers. So you can see how that is traveling there. And if you say oculomotor, so basically this nerve is going to affect how you move your eye, the muscles of the eye. And there you see that, right? Ciliary ganglion, and that is the motor component. So that will make your eye like that. So yeah, so all of these cranial nerves are arranged. I'm not going to ask you things like this, but I will. You need to know the names of the cranial nerves, and there are a couple of tables in your manual whereby the functions or the targets for each of the cranial nerve are listed. So you need to learn those. Okay, so that's basically it for tomorrow. I will see everybody there.